I found a secret diary hidden behind our wedding photo. The last entry said, "I forgive you," and the handwriting was mine. On today's episode of The Wander's Tales, we dive where quiet courage prevails. Hidden truths and hearts so bold, stories of fear left untold. If this calls to you, don't delay, subscribe, tap the bell, and stay with us. Thank you. The heat in Lagos always felt like a physical weight, a humid blanket that muffled the screams of the street vendors and the aggressive honking of the yellow Danfo buses far below our Victoria Island penthouse. It was the peak of the Harmattan season, and a fine, ghostly layer of Saharan dust had settled over everything, including the silver-framed photograph of our wedding day that sat on the mantelpiece. I remember reaching for it, intending only to wipe away the grit of the desert. But the air in the room suddenly felt thin, as if the oxygen were being sucked out by an invisible vacuum. My grip slipped, and the heavy frame crashed onto the Italian marble floor. The glass didn't just break. It seemed to explode, a crystalline protest against the silence of the apartment. As I knelt to sweep up the shards, I noticed that the velvet backing of the frame hadn't just popped loose. It had revealed a shallow, hollowed-out space in the heavy wood of the custom frame. Tucked inside was a small, leather-bound notebook, its edges frayed and its scent smelling of old cedar and something metallic, like dried blood or ancient ink. I pulled it out, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and saw the date embossed on the first page, 2018. That was the year we fell in love, the year the world felt like it was beginning for the first time. Yet as I flicked through the yellowed pages, the words didn't look like the ecstatic ramblings of a man in love. Instead of the poetry I expected, the entries were clinical, heavy with a sense of dread that made the sweat on my neck turn to ice. He didn't write about how my eyes sparkled under the dim lights of the jazz club where we met. He wrote about the calibration of her smile and the necessary distance required to maintain the illusion. My breath hitched as I read the first full entry, which described our first meeting not as a stroke of fate, but as a target acquisition. He spoke of me as if I were a fragile porcelain doll he had been tasked to glue back together, piece by jagged piece, while pretending the cracks had never existed. The modern African luxury of my living room, the velvet sofas, the gold leaf accents, the view of the Atlantic suddenly felt like a stage set, a beautiful facade designed to distract me from the rot underneath. I sat on the floor amidst the broken glass, the sharp edges pressing into my palms, and realized that every memory I held dear was being recontextualized into a narrative of surveillance and repair. He wasn't my husband in these pages. He was a sentry, a man standing guard over a secret so dark it required the total reconstruction of a human soul. The diary was a confession, a ledger of sins committed in the name of a love that felt more like a prison sentence than a romance. I turned the page to an entry dated 3 months into our relationship, a time I remembered as a blur of late-night drives through the neon-lit streets of Lekki and whispered promises over spicy grilled tilapia. But his handwriting told a different story, one where every laughter-filled dinner was a diagnostic test, and every touch was an anchor to prevent the drift. He described our first kiss with a haunting, lyrical sadness that broke my heart more than the lies did. He didn't call it a beginning. He described it as a goodbye he was never allowed to say, a final press of lips against a woman who was already fading away. It was as if he were kissing a ghost, mourning the person I used to be, even as he helped the new version of me take her first steps. I looked at the wedding photo lying face down on the floor, the version of us that was happy, radiant, and whole, and wondered who that woman actually was. The diary spoke of the year of salt, a period where he claimed my tears were so constant they left white streaks on my skin, yet I had no memory of crying. I remembered only sunshine, only the warmth of his hand in mine, only the way he looked at me as if I were the sun and the moon combined. As I read further, the psychological weight of his words began to press down on me, making the air in the penthouse feel even more claustrophobic despite the high ceilings and open floor plan. He wrote about the way I would wake up screaming in those early days, my mind trying to claw its way back to a truth that he had been hired, or perhaps had volunteered to bury deep beneath layers of artificial joy. The romance I thought we shared was revealed to be a meticulously managed recovery process, a series of positive reinforcements designed to overwrite a trauma so severe it had threatened to shatter my consciousness. He detailed the foods he fed me, the music he played, and the specific ways he spoke to me, all calculated to evoke a version of Amara that was compliant, happy, and safe. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me as I realized that my favorite songs, my sudden love for architecture, and even the way I took my coffee were all suggestions planted by him during a period of my life that had been wiped clean. I was a mosaic of his preferences, a person built from the scrap heap of another woman's disaster. The diary wasn't just a record of our love. It was a blueprint of my manufacture, a chilling testament to how easily a person can be erased and rewritten if the editor is someone they trust with their life. The ink on the page for March 14th seemed darker, as if the pen had been pressed with a desperate, trembling urgency. Elias wrote about the night of our first kiss, not as the beginning of a romance, but as a burial of the truth. In my memory, we were standing on a balcony overlooking the shimmering lights of the Eco-Atlantic project, the salt air blowing my hair across my face while a distant Afrobeat rhythm pulsed from a yacht in the harbor. I remembered his touch as tentative and sweet, a promise of a future I was finally ready to embrace. But the diary described that moment as a hollowed-out mercy. He wrote that as his lips met mine, he was looking into the eyes of a woman whose soul had been surgically scrubbed clean just weeks prior. He wasn't kissing the girl he had fallen for. He was kissing the blank slate that the doctors and the lawyers had handed back to him. He described the sickening guilt of holding me, while knowing that everything I thought I knew about my own heart was a fabrication. To him, that kiss was a goodbye to the Amara who knew the secret, a final tribute to the woman who had died so that this new, healed version could live. He wrote that every time I smiled at him that night, it felt like a serrated blade across his conscience, because my happiness was built on a foundation of absolute, state-sponsored amnesia. As I read his description of that night, I felt a phantom coldness creep into my bones, a stark contrast to the stifling Lagos heat. He detailed how he had stayed awake long after I fell asleep, watching the rise and fall of my chest, and wondering if the real me was still trapped somewhere deep inside the labyrinth of my subconscious. He wrote about the manual of my personality that he had been forced to study, a list of my previous likes and dislikes, curated by a team of specialists to ensure I didn't experience rejection of my new life. He had to learn how I liked my plantain fried, which side of the bed I preferred, and the exact pitch of my laughter. Also, he could mimic a history we had never actually shared. The diary confessed that our entire honeymoon phase was a high-stakes performance where he played the lead role, terrified that a single slip-up, a mention of a friend I no longer knew or a place I had forgotten, would cause the fragile structure of my new mind to collapse. "I'm a ghost loving a ghost," he had scribbled at the bottom of the page, the ink blurred by what looked like a fallen tear. The realization that my most cherished romantic memory was actually a calculated act of psychological stabilization made the room spin, the gold-leafed walls of our penthouse suddenly feeling like the bars of a very expensive cage. The diary entries for the following month moved away from the penthouse and into the sprawling, chaotic heart of Lekki. I read about trips we took to secluded beaches and high-end galleries, trips I remembered with vivid clarity, but the diary spoke of them as reentry simulations. He described an afternoon in an art gallery where I had stopped in front of a painting of a turbulent ocean, my eyes widening with a sudden, inexplicable terror. In my memory, I had simply been moved by the artist's use of color, but Elias wrote that I had started whispering a name he didn't recognize, a name that made the security detail shadowing us move closer. He spoke of the shadow of Lekki, a term he used to describe the parts of the city that triggered my glitches. There's a specific intersection near the bridge where he noted that my heart rate would spike to dangerous levels every time we drove past, even though I was smiling and chatting about dinner plans. He realized then that the erasure wasn't perfect. My body remembered what my mind had been forced to forget. The diary became a log of these physiological tremors, a record of a woman whose nervous system was at war with her reconstructed history. What terrified me most in this chapter was the mention of people I should have known. He wrote about the Watchers, individuals who lived in our neighborhood, people I considered friends and neighbors who were actually there to monitor my integration. He described a dinner party we hosted where a woman I remembered as my closest confidant was actually a behavioral specialist tasked with checking for signs of spontaneous recollection. The betrayal felt systemic, a conspiracy of silence that encompassed every person I had interacted with for the past 5 years. He wrote about the shadow creeping into our bed at night, how I would sometimes sit bolt upright in my sleep and speak in a voice that wasn't mine, demanding to know where the body was. My skin crawled as I realized that while I thought I was living a dream life of luxury and love, I was actually a specimen in a living laboratory, and the man I loved was the lead researcher. He wrote about the agony of having to lie to me every morning when I woke up and asked him how I had slept, hiding the fact that I had spent the night weeping for a tragedy I couldn't name. The modern, sleek surfaces of my life in Lecky felt increasingly like a thin veneer over a dark, churning abyss of forgotten crimes and silenced witnesses. Halfway through the 3rd year of entries, the diary underwent a jarring transformation. The neat, architectural script of Elias, so precise and controlled, suddenly broke off in the middle of a sentence about a trip to the Tarqua Bay. The pen seemed to have been snatched away, or perhaps surrendered. The handwriting that followed was wilder, more fluid, yet eerily familiar. It was my own handwriting, or at least a version of it from before the reconstruction. Yet, the voice in the text remained the same. It was still written from a perspective of observation, still speaking of the girl as if she were a separate entity. This new hand wrote about the thinness of the veil, describing how the medications were no longer enough to suppress the undermemory. The script was frantic, the ink bleeding through the paper in places where the writer had pressed too hard. She's looking for the keys, the entry read, but she doesn't know there are no doors left to open. The shift in handwriting suggested a fracturing of the narrative control, a moment where the editor of my life had lost his grip on the pen, or perhaps where the subject had started to write her own autopsy. As I traced the loops of my own letters on the page, a cold dread settled in my stomach. I recognized the way I crossed my T's and the specific slant of my S's, but the words they formed were alien to me. The diary spoke of the great disconnect, a period where my two selves, the one who remembered the trauma and the one who had been told she was happy, began to overlap in terrifying ways. This version of the diary described moments of temporal slippage, where I would find myself standing in the middle of a room with no idea how I got there, clutching an object that belonged to a life I no longer possessed. The voice in the diary, though written in my hand, spoke with the authority of someone who knew the end was coming. It detailed the physical toll of the erasure, the migraines that felt like lightning bolts, the sudden loss of taste, and the way the world would occasionally lose its color, turning into a monochromatic sketch of itself. It was as if the Omara being written about was a ghost being summoned into a body that no longer fit her, a soul trying to find its way back into a house that had been completely remodeled while she was away. The handwriting shift wasn't just a change in style. It was a symptom of a psychic break, a warning that the lie was becoming too heavy for the paper to hold. The diary then entered a dark period, a gap of several months in 2021 that corresponded with the time I had been told I was away in London for a specialized interior design course. In reality, the entries revealed I was never in London. I was in a private facility on the outskirts of Abaddon, a place the diary referred to only as the sanitarium of the new day. Elias's handwriting returned here, but it was haggard, the letters drooping with exhaustion. He described the missing months as a period of total system failure. He wrote about the doctors who used experimental neurotechnologies to reset the neural pathways after my first major relapse. He described the smell of ozone and antiseptic, the way my eyes looked when they were dilated by the drugs, and the absolute silence of the room where I was kept. There were no design courses, No walks through Hyde Park, no photos of Big Ben. There was only the reconstruction of a shattered psyche. He wrote about the cost of this procedure, not just the millions of naira paid to silent men in suits, but the cost to my humanity. Every time they reset me, a little more of the original Amara was lost, replaced by a smoother, more palatable version that didn't scream in the night. The details of these missing months were horrifying in their clinical detachment. Elias recorded the success rates of various memory blockers and the way my personality was refined during each session. He confessed to choosing which memories to keep and which to discard, like an editor cutting a film. He decided I should keep my love for the ocean, but forget why I was afraid of the dark. He decided I should remember our wedding, but forget the argument we had the night before the accident. I was being curated like a museum exhibit, with Elias acting as the sole curator of my history. He wrote about the loneliness of being the only person in the world who knew the truth of those months, the only one who saw me when I was a shell of a person, before they filled me back up with the artificial memories I now carried. The realization that my career, my skills, and my very passions were perhaps just plugins installed during this time made me feel like an imposter in my own skin. I looked at my hands, the hands that had supposedly designed the beautiful homes of Lagos's elite, and wondered if the talent was even mine, or if it was just another part of the package Elias had purchased to give me a life worth living. The diary's tone shifted from clinical to gothic as it recounted a night by the Lagos Lagoon, a night that served as the catalyst for the entire erasure. The entry was dated just weeks before the missing months began. Elias wrote about a frantic drive toward the water, the car smelling of burnt rubber and copper. In my mind, I had a vague, hazy memory of a flat tire and a long walk under the stars, but the diary described a scene of visceral chaos. He wrote about finding me standing at the edge of the black water, my clothes soaked and my hands stained with something that wouldn't wash away. He spoke of the weight in the trunk and the silent agreement made between two people who had everything to lose. This was the moment the lie we agreed on was born. He didn't describe what was in the water, but he described the way the ripples moved outward, carrying away the evidence of a life that had ended that night. The lagoon wasn't just a geographical feature. It was a grave for the truth. The writing in this chapter was frantic, the sentences short and jagged like broken glass. Elias described the bargain he made with the darkness. He would save me, but only if he could own the version of me that remained. He wrote about the Lagoon Protocol, a series of phone calls to powerful men who could make problems disappear for the right price. He confessed that the guilt of that night was what fueled his devotion. He wasn't just being a good husband. He was performing a lifelong penance for the things he had helped me do. The entries hinted that I had committed an act of such profound violence or negligence that my own mind had started to eat itself to escape the reality. Elias had stepped in not to seek justice, but to offer a different kind of sentence, a life of perfect, artificial bliss. He wrote about the way the moon reflected off the water that night, a cold, indifferent eye watching as we buried the past in the silt of the lagoon. As I read, I felt the phantom sensation of cold water rising around my ankles, a primal terror that suggested the lagoon was still there, lurking just beneath the surface of my consciousness, waiting for the tide to come in. On a page dated exactly 1 year after the incident, there was a single paragraph centered in the middle of the white space, surrounded by an emptiness that felt louder than words. It read, "If she ever remembers, I'm already gone. The bridge between the lie and the truth is a one-way path. To remember is to destroy the Amara I have built, and to destroy her is to kill me. If the veil lifts, do not look for me in the living. Look for me in the silence of the lagoon." This was the ultimate warning, a dead man's switch for our relationship. Elias knew that the human mind is a resilient thing, that secrets have a way of surfacing like driftwood after a storm. He had prepared for the day I would find this diary, the day the perfect life would fail to satisfy the hunger of the forgotten truth. He wrote about the poison of memory, how a single spark of recollection could burn down the entire forest of our shared history. The psychological weight of this warning was paralyzing. I looked around the penthouse, the high-end appliances, the designer furniture, the life I had built, and realized it was all contingent on my ignorance. The moment I understood the diary, the life it protected would cease to exist. Elias had designed our marriage as a suicide pact of the soul. He had tied his existence so closely to my delusion that my awakening would be his erasure. He wrote about the contingency plans he had in place for when the glitches became permanent, describing a process of vanishing that was as meticulous as the process of my creation. He wouldn't just leave. He would be erased from my life, much like my own memories had been. The diary suggested that there were people waiting in the wings, the same watchers from Lecky, who would facilitate his disappearance the moment I crossed the threshold of realization. I felt a desperate urge to close the book, to put it back in a frame, and pretend I had never seen it, but the poison was already in my system. The curiosity was a slow-acting toxin, and I was already too far gone to be saved by ignorance. As the diary progressed into the 4th year, it began to document the physical manifestations of the ghost. Elias wrote about finding me standing in front of the bathroom mirror for hours, tilting my head at angles that seemed unnatural, as if I were trying to catch a glimpse of someone standing behind me. He described the stranger in the mirror, a version of me that he saw reflected in my eyes during moments of system instability. He wrote that sometimes my Lagosian accent would shift into a dialect I had never studied, a rough, guttural tongue that spoke of a childhood in a part of the country I had supposedly never visited. My habits were changing, too. I started to develop a taste for bitter herbs and raw onions, things the new Amara was supposed to find repulsive. He wrote that the stranger was getting stronger, pushing through the layers of refined personality, like a weed through concrete. The diary detailed his attempts to prune these new behaviors, the way he would subtly correct my speech or replace the foods I had started to crave. But he confessed that he was losing the battle. He wrote about the uncanny valley of our marriage, the feeling that he was living with a brilliant imitation of a human being, a creature that looked and sounded like his wife, but had black holes where the foundation should be. He described the horror of waking up to find me staring at him in the dark, my expression completely blank, devoid of the love and warmth he had worked so hard to cultivate. "She's coming back," he wrote, "and she is angry." This stranger wasn't just a memory. She was a vengeful force of nature, a suppressed identity fighting to reclaim the body that had been stolen from her. I looked at my own reflection in the glass of the window, the Lagos skyline shimmering behind me, and for a split second I didn't recognize the woman looking back. The face was beautiful, pampered, and perfect, but the eyes were ancient and heavy with a grief that didn't belong in this penthouse. The diary finally began to explain the legalities of the erasure. This wasn't just a husband's obsession. It was a high-level corporate and legal operation. Elias wrote about the agreement, a document signed in a sterile hospital room while I was still drifting in a drug-induced coma. He described the party of the first part and the party of the second part. The lie wasn't just that I was innocent. The lie was that the event had never happened at all. He detailed the cleansing of the records, the way police reports were altered, and witnesses were relocated with generous pensions. He wrote about the moral bankruptcy of the deal, acknowledging that we had purchased my freedom with the currency of total fabrication. The life I chose instead was a gilded cage designed by lawyers and psychologists to ensure I would never be a liability to the powerful interests involved in the original incident. The details of the agreement were sickening. It wasn't a choice I had made. It was a choice made for me by a man who claimed to love me and a system that wanted to protect itself. Elias wrote that he had signed his own life away as a guarantor of my silence. If I ever broke the mental seal, he would be the one to pay the price. He described the performance bond of our marriage, a literal financial and legal obligation to keep me happy and ignorant. Our love was a contract, a series of clauses and subclauses designed to mitigate risk. He wrote about the nausea of the soul he felt every time we signed a new lease or bought a new car, knowing that the money came from a fund established to maintain the integrity of the subject. I realized then that my entire existence was a line item in a corporate budget, a managed risk that Elias had been hired to oversee. The lie we agreed on was a masterpiece of modern corruption, a beautiful, high-tech version of a deal with the devil, and the diary was the only evidence that the contract even existed. Then came the description of the accident, the event that had necessitated the erasure. Elias didn't hold back. The prose became visceral, smelling of gasoline and wet earth. He described a high-speed chase along the third mainland bridge, the lights of Lagos a blur of yellow and red as my luxury car tore through the night. He wrote about the impact, the sound of metal screaming against metal, and the way the air was suddenly filled with the scent of lilies, a perfume I had been wearing that night. He didn't say who else was in the car or what we hit, but he described the aftermath with haunting precision. He found me crawling away from the wreckage, my face a mask of blood and glass, whispering I didn't mean to over and over again. The accident wasn't just a mechanical failure. It was a moment of profound, irreversible human error. The diary described how he had arrived at the scene before the authorities, thanks to a tracking device he had installed on my car for my safety. He wrote about the choice he faced in those few minutes before the sirens arrived, to let the law take its course and watch me spend the rest of my life in a crumbling Nigerian prison, or to invoke the protocol. He chose the latter. He wrote about the way he had manipulated the scene, the way he had moved the bodies, and the way he had whispered in my ear as I drifted out of consciousness. Forget this. I will make you forget this. The forgotten accident was the seed from which my entire current life had grown. It was the original sin of our modern African paradise. Every luxury I enjoyed, every moment of peace I felt, was a direct result of the blood on the asphalt that night. The diary was a map of the crime scene, a detailed accounting of the lives that were ended so that mine could be restarted. The final chapter of this sequence dealt with the emotional toll on Elias, the weight of silence that had slowly crushed the man I thought I knew. He wrote about the loneliness of the keeper, the realization that he could never truly be himself around me because his self was the only thing that could destroy me. He described the theater of the everyday, the exhausting effort required to maintain a conversation about the weather or the news while the memory of the lagoon sat between us like a third person at the table. He wrote about the erasure of Elias, how he had slowly let go of his own dreams, his own family, and his own history to become the person I needed him to be. He was a man who had hollowed himself out to make room for my reconstructed soul. The prose in this section was mournful, a threnody for a life he had surrendered. He wrote about the silence of the penthouse, how the beautiful rooms were actually soundproofed to keep the world out, but also to keep the screams in. He confessed that he sometimes hated me, not for what I had done, but for the fact that I got to forget it while he had to remember it every second of every day. He was the memory bearer, the one who carried the cross of our shared history so that I could walk around light as air. He wrote about the price of silence being his own slow death, a psychic erosion that had left him a shell of a man. To love you, he wrote, is to be your jailer and your fellow inmate. The weight of his sacrifice was staggering, a devotion so absolute it bordered on the pathological. I looked at the diary, then at the door, half expecting him to walk in and take it from me to reset me one last time. But the diary had already told me, if she ever remembers, I am already gone. The silence in the penthouse was no longer a sanctuary. It was the sound of a man who had finally finished his sentence. The sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my Ikoyi office, casting long, geometric shadows across the mood boards and fabric swatches that defined my professional existence. I had always been praised for my instinctive grasp of space and light, for the way I could walk into a derelict colonial villa or a sterile Lekki penthouse and breathe a cohesive, calming soul into it. But as I read the entry for October 2022, my hands began to shake so violently that the heavy diary nearly slipped from my fingers. Elias wrote about the selection process for my career with the cold efficiency of a corporate recruiter. He described how he and a team of occupational therapists had tested my aptitude while I was still in the suggestible state of early recovery. They had presented me with colors, textures, and blueprints, watching my pupillary response to determine which path would keep me most centered and distracted from the structural void. My passion for interior design wasn't an organic emergence of my personality. It was a curated hobby designed to keep my mind occupied with the surface of things, so I would never look at the foundation. He wrote that they chose interiors specifically because it gave me a sense of control over my environment, a psychological countermeasure to the absolute lack of control I had over my own history. The realization that my talent was a plug-in made the beautiful room around me feel like a film set that was about to be struck. I looked at the sketches of the boutique hotel I was currently designing, the soothing teals, the earthy ochres, the carefully placed African sculptures, and saw them for what they were, a complex series of soothing stimuli meant to keep my neural pathways from firing in the wrong directions. Elias confessed in the diary that he had even ghost-written my early business proposals, using his own background in structural engineering to give my designs the technical weight they needed to succeed in the cutthroat Lagos market. He wrote about the irony of me becoming a celebrity designer in Nigeria's elite circles, a woman famous for creating authentic spaces while living a life that was entirely synthetic. The wealth, the accolades, the glossy magazine covers, they were all part of the performance bond mentioned in earlier chapters. My success was a safety net, a way to ensure I would never have a reason to look back, because the view in front of me was so meticulously dazzling. I was a bird in a gilded cage who had been taught to believe she had designed the gold leaf herself. Driven by a desperate, jagged need for something real, I grabbed my car keys and fled the Penthouse, driving aimlessly through the snarling traffic of the Falomo Bridge until I found myself in the older, leafier parts of Ikoyi. The diary had mentioned a specific address, a derelict mansion hidden behind a wall of overgrown bougainvillea, that it called the origin point. As I pulled up to the rusted iron gates, a violent sensory flashback hit me with the force of a physical blow. The smell of rotting tropical fruit and stagnant water filled my nostrils, and for a split second, the modern SUV I was sitting in vanished, replaced by the memory of a crumpled silver sedan and the sound of a woman screaming my name. The diary had hinted that this was where the agreement was first tested, where Elias had brought me to see if the first round of erasure had taken hold. I stepped out of the car, the humid air sticking to my skin like a second, unwanted layer of clothing. The house stood like a silent witness, its windows shattered like broken eyes, staring back at me with the weight of a decade of secrets. I realized this wasn't just a site of trauma. It was a memorial to the woman I used to be, the one who hadn't been refined by Elias's careful hands. The diary's entry for this location was written in a tone of profound exhaustion. Elias described standing in this very spot, watching me walk through these ruins with a look of total blankness, a hollowed-out queen in a kingdom of dust. He wrote that it was here he realized the erasure was a permanent sentence, not just for me, but for him. He had to stand by and watch me touch the walls of my childhood home and feel absolutely nothing, not even a flicker of recognition for the marks on the doorframe where I had grown up. He described the ghosts of Ikoyi not as supernatural entities, but as the discarded fragments of my identity that he had to gather up and bury in the backyard of his mind. He wrote about the physical pain of seeing me so healed that I was essentially a stranger to my own past. As I stood there, a sudden, sharp memory pierced the veil. A young girl laughing, the scent of expensive cigars, and a man's voice, not Elias's, calling out a name that sounded like Amara but held a different weight, a different rhythm. The stranger in the mirror was no longer a reflection. She was standing right there in the tall grass, her eyes full of a fire that the new Amara was never meant to possess. Returning to the Penthouse, I turned the pages to a section titled The Ledger of Loss. Here, the diary shifted focus from my reconstruction to Elias's own disintegration. He wrote about the architectural career he had abandoned, a dream of building sustainable housing for the urban poor in Makoko, to become the full-time manager of my delusion. To keep me safe, he had to be invisible. He had to scrub his own digital footprint, distance himself from his family, and live as a man with no history, so that his past would never collide with my new present. He wrote that the price of erasure was the total annihilation of his own ambitions. He was a brilliant man who had reduced himself to a caregiver in a suit, a man whose only metric of success was the absence of my nightmares. He described the bitterness that would occasionally flare up when he saw me receiving awards or being toasted at high society galas, knowing that he was the silent engineer of every triumph. Yet he could never claim even a fraction of the credit without risking the collapse of the subject. The prose in this chapter was saturated with a dark, philosophical mourning. Elias questioned whether his love for me was even love anymore, or if it had mutated into a form of Stockholm Syndrome in reverse, where the jailer becomes obsessed with the happiness of the prisoner to justify the kidnapping. He wrote about the erasure of his own desire, describing how our intimate moments felt like acts of theater because he was always monitoring my reactions, always checking for the glitches that might indicate a return of the trauma. He confessed that he had forgotten what it felt like to be touched by someone who actually knew him, the real him, the man who had seen the blood on the asphalt and the weight in the trunk. By giving me a life of pure light, he had condemned himself to a life of absolute shadow. The diary was his only outlet, the only place where he could exist as a three-dimensional human being instead of a supportive husband character in the movie of my life. Reading this, I felt a wave of profound pity for the man who was currently in the kitchen, probably preparing a dinner of my favorite programmed foods, unaware that the ghost he had been guarding was finally waking up. I reached the section where the handwriting had shifted halfway through the wild, fluid script that I now recognized with a gut punch of certainty. It was mine, but it wasn't the me who sat in this penthouse. It was the me from the transition period, the woman who was halfway between the trauma and the erasure. In these pages, I had written to myself a desperate message across time. If you're reading this, my past self wrote, it means the drugs failed. It means the agreement wasn't enough to hold the tide back. My own handwriting described the lagoon incident not as an accident, but as a sacrifice. I wrote about the person who died that night, a man named Chitty, a name that sent a physical jolt of electricity through my brain. Chitty wasn't a stranger. He was my first husband, the man I had loved before the world turned to glass and metal. The diary, written in my own hand, confessed that I was the one driving. I was the one who had been drinking, and I was the one who had begged Elias to make it go away because I couldn't live with the sight of Chitty's broken body in the passenger seat. The second handwriting revealed the most devastating truth of all. Elias didn't force the erasure on me. I had demanded it. I had been so broken by the guilt of killing Chitty that I had weaponized Elias's love for me, forcing him to use his connections and his life to delete the memory of my crime. I wrote about the numbing beauty of the drugs and how I couldn't wait for the new Amara to take over so I wouldn't have to feel the weight of the water anymore. This version of me, the one in the diary, was the architect of her own amnesia. She had coached Elias on how to lie to her. She had helped him choose the interior design career as a distraction. She had even signed the agreement with a steady hand, eager to be murdered so that a happier version could live in her place. The shift in handwriting wasn't a psychic break. It was a handover. It was the old Amara giving the keys to the new one, with Elias acting as the reluctant gatekeeper. Forgive him for what he is about to do. I had written in my own slanted script, because I am the one who gave the order. Chapter 17. The final confrontation. I closed the diary and stood up, the silence of the penthouse now feeling like a physical pressure against my eardrums. I walked into the kitchen, with a scent of ginger and garlic hung in the air. Elias was there, his back to me, meticulously chopping vegetables for a jollof rice he knew I loved. He didn't turn around when I entered, but I saw his shoulders stiffen, a subtle shift in his posture that told me he already knew. The bridge had been crossed. The harmattan dust outside seemed to thicken, blurring the lights of the city into a hazy, dreamlike glow. I found it, I said, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else, someone older, someone who had seen the bottom of the lagoon. He stopped chopping, the knife resting against the wooden board with a dull thud. He stood perfectly still for a long moment, a man who had been holding his breath for 5 years and had finally run out of air. When he turned around, his face wasn't a mask of fear or guilt. It was a landscape of profound, soul-deep relief. I knew this day would come. He whispered, his voice raspy and thin. I tried to make the lies so beautiful that you'd never want to leave it, Amara. But the truth is a living thing. It breathes, even under the water. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the erased man for the first time. I saw the gray in his hair that I had never noticed, the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, and the way he looked at me not with the performative adoration of a perfect husband, but with the weary, tragic love of a man who had guarded a grave for half a decade. I realized then that our entire marriage was a suicide pact, where he was the only one who had to stay conscious for the death. He didn't offer any excuses. He didn't try to gaslight me. He simply stood there in our multi-million naira kitchen and waited for me to decide if he was a savior or a monster. The confrontation wasn't an explosion. It was a collapse, the two of us standing amidst the wreckage of a 5-year-old crime, finally speaking in our real voices. Chapter 18. Loving her was worth being erased. Why did you do it? I asked, the words feeling like stones in my mouth. Why didn't you just let me go to prison? Why didn't you let me mourn shitty? Elias stepped toward me, but stopped just short of the kitchen island, as if afraid that the slightest touch would cause me to shatter. Because you were already dying, he said, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. The guilt was eating your brain, Amara. You were catatonic. You were trying to follow him into the water every single day. The doctor said you wouldn't survive another month of the memory. I didn't do it to save my life. I did it to save yours, even if it meant I had to lose you in the process. He explained that loving her was worth being erased wasn't just a line in a diary. It was the mantra that had kept him sane. He had accepted the role of the keeper because he believed that a version of me living a lie was better than the real me being dead. He had traded his soul for my ignorance, and he had done it willingly, with a devotion that was as terrifying as it was beautiful. He spoke of the philosophical weight of his choice, how he had spent 5 years wondering if he was a god or a devil. He had watched me grow, watched me succeed, and watched me love him, all while knowing that the love was a byproduct of a medical procedure. He confessed that the hardest part wasn't the lying. It was the moments when I was truly happy, because those were the moments he felt the most like a thief. He had stolen my grief, and in doing so, he had stolen my humanity. A person is the sum of their scars, Amara, he said, his voice breaking. And I try to make you smooth. I try to give you a life with no edges. But a life with no edges has no shape. He looked around the penthouse at the life he chose instead, and I saw the absolute vanity of the project. We were two ghosts living in a museum of a life that never happened. He had erased himself to give me a shadow, and we were both drowning in the lack of light. Chapter 19. The last page I returned to the diary, flicking to the final pages, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The entries here were dated just days ago, the handwriting a frantic, messy scrawl that looked like a man running out of time. Elias wrote about the tremor in the penthouse, the minor earthquake that had caused the wedding photo to fall. He had seen the frame hit the floor from across the room, and in that moment he knew the lagoon protocol had reached its expiration date. He didn't pick up the diary. He didn't hide it again. He left it there, behind the shattered glass, a silent invitation for me to finally wake up. He wrote that he was tired, so tired of being the only one who remembered the scent of the lilies and the sound of the metal. The final pages weren't a confession. They were a resignation. He was resigning from his position as my guardian. He was giving me back the right to suffer, the right to be the woman who had killed her husband and survived. The very last entry described the true nature of the agreement. It revealed that the powerful men who had facilitated the erasure, the corporate interests I had designed for, were now moving to retire the project. My recovery had been too successful, my public profile too high. I was becoming a risk again, Elias wrote that they were planning to relocate us to start the process over in a different city with different names and different memories. He realized then that the erasure would never end. It would just be a cycle of reboots until there was nothing left of either of us. "I am already gone," he had written, echoing the warning from Chapter 8. He had made arrangements for me to have access to the funds and the documents I would need to truly disappear, not as a subject, but as a free woman. The final pages were a map to my escape, a last act of devotion from a man who had finally realized that the ultimate expression of love wasn't holding on, but letting go. He had written his own ending so that I could finally write my beginning. Chapter 20. "I forgive you." The final sentence of the diary was written on a page by itself, the ink fresh in the handwriting. Impossible. I stared at the words, my vision blurring as the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Loving her was worth being erased. The penultimate line read, in Elias's steady hand. But the very last line, the one that ended the 5-year odyssey of lies and reconstructions, was written in a script that made my blood turn to ice. It was signed in handwriting that was mine, the current mine, the one I used to sign my design contracts and my credit card slips. It wasn't the past Amara or the transition Amara. It was the woman I was right now. I looked at the pen sitting on the kitchen island, a heavy gold fountain pen that Elias had given me for our anniversary, and the memory finally, violently, broke through the last of the dams. I hadn't found the diary today. I had found it a month ago. I remembered now. I remembered finding the book, reading the truth, and the sheer, agonizing weight of the lagoon returning to my soul. I remembered the screaming matches, the tears, and the realization that I couldn't live with the truth any more than I could live with the lie. And then I remembered the most horrifying part of all. I'd asked him to do it again. I had been the one to write "I forgive you" on that final page, a message to myself for the next time I woke up. I had signed my own death warrant for the second time, agreeing to a reset because the pain of Chitty's death was still too much to bear. I looked at Elias, and I saw the crushing sadness in his eyes as he realized I had remembered everything, including the fact that I had chosen to forget. The diary ended with my own forgiveness because I was the only one who could grant it. As the doctors, the watchers in their white coats, stepped out from the shadows of the hallway to begin the next reconstruction, I looked at my own handwriting one last time. "I forgive you," it said. And then the world went white. OUTRO. He spent 5 years building this perfect life to hide the monster I used to be. Now I know the truth. I didn't just forget my past. I paid him to delete it. Would you choose a beautiful lie over a tragic reality? Let me know in the comments. Follow for the full story.